I still remember the exact moment the air left my lungs. I was sitting in a lawyer's conference room, watching my parents smile like they had already won a game nobody else in that building even knew was being played. My father straightened his tie twice. My mother kept smoothing the front of her blouse with one perfectly manicured hand. They had been waiting for this specific day for nearly 20 years, 2 full decades of calculated Sunday dinners, of phone calls that sounded warm but felt hollow, of showing up at Grandpa Howard's door only when the stakes were high enough to bother, and then the attorney opened the folder sitting on his desk. My mother's smile disappeared first. What happened inside that room over the next 40 minutes didn't just alter the direction of my life, it dismantled the version of my family I had been quietly grieving for years. By the time the attorney finished reading, every single person in that office understood exactly who my parents had always been underneath the performance. Can you imagine watching your own mother scream inside a law office while your father lunged across a desk trying to grab legal documents? Because I didn't have to imagine it. I was sitting right there watching every second of it unfold. My grandfather, Howard James Merritt, was the kind of man who fixed things. Not just physical things, leaky faucets, broken screen doors, old lawnmowers, but people. He had a way of sitting quietly beside someone who was struggling and somehow making them feel like the world was still manageable. He had raised my father, Dennis, as a single parent after my grandmother died of cancer when my father was only 9. Grandpa Howard worked as an electrician for 35 years. He drove the same truck for 18 of those years. He never took a vacation that cost more than a tank of gas and a fishing license. I loved him the way you love someone who makes you feel safe in your own skin. My parents, Dennis and Roberta Merritt, experienced Grandpa Howard differently. My mother in particular had never made much effort to disguise her impatience with him. She found his stories repetitive. She found his house cluttered. She found his lifestyle, as she once said to my father while I was listening from the hallway at 14 years old, embarrassing for a man who apparently had money sitting in accounts doing nothing useful. That word useful has lived in my memory ever since I was 24 years old. When I first overheard my parents having a specific conversation about Grandpa Howard's estate, I had come home to collect winter clothes from storage and the kitchen light was on. My mother's voice carried through the wall clearly. She was saying that the farmhouse property alone, the one Grandpa Howard had owned outright since the 1980s, was worth somewhere close to $500,000 in the current market. My father made an interested sound. My mother said they just needed to stay visible, stay consistent, and not do anything that might make the old man suspicious. I stood completely still in that hallway and felt something crack open inside my chest. Have you ever heard someone you love described as an obstacle rather than a person? That is the only way I can explain what that moment felt like suddenly seeing through a wall that had always been there but that I had refused to look at directly. I did not confront my parents that evening. I drove home and sat in my apartment kitchen until almost midnight, thinking through everything I had heard and everything it confirmed about things I had already sensed but pushed aside before. And then I made a quiet decision. I was going to do what I had always done anyway, which was simply love my grandfather the way he deserved to be loved. Not because of anything strategic, just because he was Howard Merritt, and he deserved it, and I was his granddaughter. Over the following years, I watched my parents manage their relationship with Grandpa Howard the way a project manager handles a long-term account. My mother started bringing homemade food on her visits. My father volunteered to accompany Grandpa to medical appointments and then reported those acts of service to relatives at every available opportunity. They attended his church Christmas dinner for the first time in years. They called every Sunday morning without fail. From a distance, it looked like a family coming together around an aging patriarch. From where I was standing, it looked like a long audition. What nobody saw because nobody was looking for it was me. I drove out to Grandpa Howard's property on ordinary Tuesday afternoons. I sat with him on his back porch while he drank instant coffee and talked about his years working in the trades. I helped him sort through boxes in his storage barn. I took him to the pharmacy, to the hardware store, to the diner on Route 9 where he always ordered the same open-faced turkey sandwich. He told me things during those visits that he never mentioned around my parents' memories of my grandmother, quiet regrets about paths not taken, a steady and private pride about things he had built with his own hands over the course of an honest life. He saw me very clearly. And I believe, looking back, that he saw my parents clearly too. When Grandpa Howard was diagnosed with a progressive heart condition at 80 years old, my parents' behavior shifted in ways that were almost painful to observe. The visits became more frequent and more conspicuous. My mother began researching his medications online and presenting her findings as though she had become his dedicated medical advocate overnight. My father started mentioning, with studied casualness, that he would be happy to take over managing the property taxes if Grandpa Howard ever found that paperwork burdensome. Grandpa Howard thanked them politely and changed the subject every single time. During one of my private visits around that period, Grandpa Howard said something to me that I have turned over in my mind hundreds of times since. We were sitting on the porch in early October, and the light was going golden through the trees at the edge of his property. He looked over at me and said, very quietly, "Eleanor, I want you to know that I see the difference between people who show up and people who perform showing up. I always have." I asked him what he meant exactly. He smiled and said, "You will understand it better later. Just keep being exactly who you are." Grandpa Howard passed away the following February, on a Sunday morning, in the house he had lived in for over 40 years. My father called me from his car. I could hear my mother's voice in the background asking sharp, practical questions before my father had even finished telling me the news. I said nothing on that call. I thanked my father for letting me know, and then I sat on my bathroom floor and cried for a long time. The funeral was attended by more people than my parents expected. Neighbors, former colleagues, men from Grandpa Howard's church. A woman who had been his friend since the 1970s and who gripped my hand at the reception and told me he had talked about me constantly. My parents stood near the front accepting condolences with the correct expressions on their faces. I stood near the back and shook hands and tried to hold myself together through the afternoon. 6 weeks after the funeral, we received certified letters from an attorney named Paul Weston requesting our attendance at the formal reading of Howard James Merritt's last will and testament. My parents were at my apartment within an hour of receiving their letter. My mother was already talking about the farmhouse. My father was already making calculations out loud about what the land might yield if developed. I made them both tea and said little and watched them and thought about what Grandpa Howard had said about the difference between showing up and performing. Showing up, the morning of the will reading, I wore a gray sweater Grandpa Howard had bought me one Christmas because he said the color suited my eyes. My parents arrived at the attorney's office before I did and had already claimed seats directly in front of Paul Weston's desk when I walked in. Front row, center, smiling. I sat slightly apart from them, and I folded my hands in my lap and I waited quietly. Paul Weston was a compact, methodical man who seemed entirely unbothered by the tension sitting in that room. He read through the opening formalities, then addressed several small bequests, a set of woodworking tools to a neighbor, a donation to the local volunteer fire department, a modest sum to a young man from the church who was working toward a trade certification. Then he reached the section pertaining to my parents. Paul Weston read without inflection. To his son Dennis Howard Merritt and Dennis's wife Roberta M. Merritt, Grandpa Howard left nothing. Not the farmhouse, not the savings, not any personal property of any kind. Nothing. What would you have done? Can you believe what happened next? My mother's reaction was immediate and uncontrolled. She made a sharp, high sound and pushed back hard from her chair. My father went completely rigid and then stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He pointed at the papers on Paul Weston's desk and insisted that something was wrong, that there had been some kind of error, that they needed to stop the whole proceeding and start over. My mother said she wanted to speak to someone else immediately. My father actually stepped forward and reached for the document with his hands, and Paul Weston moved it aside with the calm efficiency of someone who had clearly anticipated exactly this moment. I watched all of it from my chair. I did not move. Then Paul Weston looked directly at me and said, "Miss Eleanor Merritt, your grandfather left a personal statement to be read aloud in this room, but only in the event that your parents responded to the previous section in the manner they just have." Those were his exact written instructions. The entire room went silent. My mother turned around and stared at me. My father lowered his arm. Paul Weston put on his reading glasses and began. What Grandpa Howard had written was several pages long and absolutely precise. He described, in his own plain and honest language, the pattern he had observed in my parents' behavior over many years, the direct correlation between his declining health and their suddenly increasing presence, the conversations reported back to him by members of his community, the way warmth from my father and mother had consistently arrived attached to something they wanted. He wrote that he harbored no bitterness toward either of them. He wrote that he had simply watched and understood and made his decisions accordingly. He left his entire estate to me. The farmhouse, the savings accounts, the old truck, everything without exception. My parents did not speak to me directly after leaving that office. My father paused in the doorway and said something cutting that I absorbed without responding to, because I had already received the only words from my family that truly mattered, and those words had just been read aloud in that room by Paul Weston. The legal challenges my parents filed over the following months went nowhere at all. Grandpa Howard and Paul Weston had spent nearly 4 years building that will into something airtight. Every potential objection had been predicted and addressed in precise language. My parents' attorney informed them that continuing to pursue the matter would cost substantially more than it could ever recover. I kept the farmhouse. I still drive out there on Tuesday afternoons sometimes, out of habit and out of love. I use a portion of what Grandpa Howard left me to fund a small annual scholarship at the local trade school, awarded in his name, to students pursuing electrician certification. It felt right. It felt like something he would choose. I no longer have a relationship with my parents. That is not a decision I made in grief or in anger. It is a decision I arrived at with complete clarity after everything I witnessed in that conference room and everything I had understood quietly for a long time before it. Some people show up in your life. Some people only perform showing up. After a certain point, you stop pretending you cannot see the difference. What Grandpa Howard truly left me was not only a farmhouse and a set of savings accounts. He left me proof that being genuinely seen by the right person quietly, consistently, without any audience matters more than any performance ever could. He left me the understanding that love which asks for nothing in return is the only love that actually holds. And he left me the memory of an October afternoon, golden light falling through his trees, his steady voice telling me simply to keep being exactly who I am. I am still working on that, but I think I am getting there. If my story meant something to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.